Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Fight for Our Freedom Radio. And I'm your host, Badbaby. And tonight we are honored to have with us Judy Byington. Judy is a child abuse recovery speaker and the author of the book 22 Faces. And we're going to go inside the extraordinary life of Jenny Hill. We'll talk a little bit about her. We're going to talk a little bit about the Pope and some other things that Judy has touched on. And how are you tonight, Judy?
I'm great.
Well, it's good to have you come back. Happy birthday.
Well, thank you. Had a great time.
How dare you go out partying without me?
Well, my partying is with my family. We have a great family that we get together and do lots of fun things.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad you had a good time. I was starting to worry that my emails weren't getting through.
I'm sorry. I had problems with my email one day, and unfortunately it was the day you were trying to get a hold of me.
You know, it's funny because I've been hearing rumors about the people in Southern California are having a lot of internet problems and cell phone problems and power outages, and then I heard that yesterday that was going on sporadically around the East Coast. And the day that was happening on the East Coast, my computer kept locking up and going down. I quit fighting with it. I shut it off. So are we being bombarded with some kind of a wave here? You know, I
don't know whether to be concerned about that or not. It's hard to tell sometimes.
Well, in Southern California, I assumed that the fires had a lot to do with it, you know.
Probably.
Yeah. So let's explain to everybody that's new to coming into the window a little bit about what you do, how you got connected up with Jenny, and a little bit later on I want to get into our feelings about the Pope coming here.
Well, that's a whole other area that I've been exploring for the past couple of years. But to give you a little background on me, I was a therapist for 23 years. I used to be head of Family Counseling Center in Provo, Utah. I was supervisor over mental health, children's services in Alberta, Canada, and did private therapy and worked in child welfare and protective services. How I became acquainted with Jenny is quite a story. While I was doing therapy, I would have people come into me wanting counseling, and they would say things like, mainly women, things like, I can't remember my childhood, I have blank periods in my life. And at that time, when I was this so-called big therapist, I really didn't understand what was going on or how to help these people.
So when they said they couldn't remember their childhood, was it just parts of their childhood or their whole childhood?
People who, I found out these people had been ritually abused, and people who have been ritually abused cannot remember their childhood. They have whole entire areas of their life that are absolutely blank. And that has to do with their alter personalities that are formed, which I can explain a little bit later. But, yeah, it's quite a bit different than somebody that just can't I mean, we all can't remember, you know, a large part of our childhood because those brain cells die, and we literally can't remember it. But
why is it, Judy, that we remember getting our fanny paddled?
Why we remember what? I couldn't understand that.
When we get a good paddling from our parents, you know, we don't ever forget that, do we?
No, we don't. When we have trauma, any child that goes through trauma will put that trauma in the back of their mind because it's very difficult for them to handle it. But when they get into a safe situation or when they are older and their perpetrator or parents or whoever did the paddling aren't around, then those memories come back. It's a healing process for the brain. So that's one of the reasons why people who have multiple personalities are very brilliant, actually, and can remember things in very minute detail because those memories are held in the parts of the brain, and they don't have to deal with them until later. And then when they come back in full force as if they happened yesterday. I can explain that a little bit, but let me give you a little bit more background on myself. I was a therapist for those many years and worked in child welfare and so forth. And then I had to retire. I had a child who became very ill, and it forced me into retirement. And while I was retired, there were some women that knew that I had been supervisor in mental health and had been a counselor. And they were people who had been ritually abused, who were wanting some help. And they actually, their mother lived close to me, and she approached me and asked me to help them. And these are the first people that I became aware of who had been ritually abused, and it was after I retired from the profession. And since that time, that was about, that was back in 1990, many, many years ago. But since that time, I have become acquainted with hundreds and hundreds of people who have been ritually abused through my work and through my book, 22 Faces. How 22 Faces started was these women who came to me were actually cousins, and they were married, and they had their own children, but one of their fathers had been arrested by the Utah Attorney General ritual abuse investigators. In fact, he was their first arrest. And so I need to give some background on how that occurred. Back in 1980, there was a book that came out called Michelle Remembers. And this was the biography of a woman who grew up in Canada. And as a 6-year-old, her mother gave her over to a satanic coven, and she was ritually abused. And after she grew up, she began having these memories of abuse, which people do. Let me explain these repressed memories before we go too far, just so your listeners will understand. We could all be multiple personalities if we've gone through the trauma that these ritual abuse survivors have gone through. Think of your mind as a tree, and that trunk of the tree is your core personality. And as you have different experiences, there are little neurons that form in your brain, and they capture the memories of that experience, and they're hooked together by little electrical circuits. Well, if you're a child and you're going through trauma, those neurons form and those memories form, but the electrical circuits don't connect to the core personality. They kind of sit out there on like a branch of a tree, sit out in that tree, and they're held by alter personalities who form those memories. Because a child going through extreme trauma like ritual abuse is, and when I talk about ritual abuse, I'm talking about children who have seen or even been made to participate in the murder of other children. They have been sexually abused. Sexual abuse is very much a part of satanic ritual abuse. And that is so traumatic for them that they can't handle it. And so our mind, which is a very wonderful organism, protects them by covering that trauma by forming an alter personality, and they hold that trauma in the back of the mind. And then as they grow up and gradually get away from the perpetrators, then their mind feels safe, and they start to release those memories. And it's like post-traumatic stress. In fact, it's called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. By the way, a multiple personality is only formed with children who go through trauma. Adults who go through trauma tend to go into post-traumatic stress. Post-traumatic stress is commonly, like people who are in war experiences. They go through traumatic experiences, and then when they come back home and are away from the war, then they have these flood of memories that come back of these war experiences, and that's called post-traumatic stress. Well, we all do that. It's called disassociation. Like on one end of the spectrum, you have common daydreaming. Like when I was a child and I was sitting in school and I didn't want to be there, and I daydream, pretend I was outside playing or something like that. That's daydreaming. And then kind of in the middle of the spectrum is post-traumatic stress. And then on the far end, on the other side, is multiple personality disorder, which is, like I say, only formed with children. So it's a very extreme form of disassociation.
Now, children that are ritually abused, do they daydream a lot? Do they, disassociate from, just regular going to school and daydream a lot?
Well, what happens with a child, and I would encourage you to go into my website, 22faces.com, and in that you will see, you can read the first 3 chapters of my book, 22 Faces, because those first 3 chapters, I take Jenny as a 5-year-old child, and she's going to kindergarten, and going into her alter personalities as she goes through kindergarten. So it really gives you an insight of how a child copes with life when they are multiple, because they don't daydream. They literally, the alters will take over, and an alter will, like Jenny, in the first chapter of the book, she's walking to kindergarten, and she has to walk past this corner house. Well, in the corner house are her abusers who abuse her after kindergarten every day. And so she gets stressed out as she gets to the corner house, so one of her alters takes over. And as far as Jenny's concerned, she's walking to school, and then all of a sudden she wakes up in kindergarten, and she doesn't know how she got there. Well, the reason is that her alter personality took over to get her body, past that gray house and over to the school where she felt safer. And that's the difference between daydreaming and a multiple personality, is where the actual alter takes over and takes over the mind and body.
And then when she does get to school and realizes she has a blank, how did I get here, she has no recollection of what happened between the 2 times?
No, and she doesn't. And the alter, like in the front of the book, is an alter chart, and Jenny has 22 different personalities. And the alters themselves, when they come out, they don't know what's happened between then and the last time they were out. And that's also explained in the book, where the alters will come out and say, hey, what happened? I haven't, seen this place, or I don't know where this place is or where we are or anything. They don't have that memory. The only memory they have is when they were, when they were out before. For instance, one time we spent 20 years writing the book, and Jenny wanted me to meet one of her head alters, which is called JJ. And she says, I'll go in and ask JJ to come forward, and she did. And when JJ came forward, she says, how did we get here? She says, I can't. At the time, Jenny was living in a trailer, and JJ didn't know, how she got to the trailer, because the last time she was out, they were living somewhere else. So that the alters also have these blank period of memories, as well as the core personality.
Wow, that's got to be traumatizing for every alter in her life. And she could actually call them forward?
Yes, and people who have multiple personalities can do that. In fact, they also have a state that they call co-conscious, where there may be several alters present, and the core personality may be present too, and then they decide who is going to talk and who is going to, make the body function. That's also quite common. Jenny explained it's like watching a movie from the back of your mind, and you can see what you're doing, and you can hear yourself talking, but you don't have any control over the situation because another alter, is taking care of the situation. The alters are formed to protect the personality. That's their function, is to protect the person from whatever trauma they're going through. And like I say, when Jenny was a little girl and she was walking to, it was very traumatic for her to walk past this gray house, so an alter took over to take over that stress and get her, over to school.
So actually the alternate personalities aren't really a bad thing. They're a blessing so that the person doesn't, without them, wouldn't the person crack?
They would. They would literally go crazy with what is happening to them. So the alters do protect them. In the front of the book is an alter chart, and Jenny's particular personality split into 3 separate alter families. The head alter, who's called JJ, was over her sexual abuse. She, like many ritually abused children, began being sexually abused when she was 4 years old. And at that time, JJ was formed, and she would take over when she was during Jenny's sexual abuse and have the memory of that sexual abuse so that Jenny didn't have to handle it. And so it was a very protective alter personality. But as Jenny grew up, of course, so did JJ, and JJ got used to taking over and wanting to take over in certain situations, and then that kind of got out of control. But you can all read that in the book. But back to the alter chart, when some of the sexual experiences took place, JJ only liked the pleasurable parts of sex. And so when it got to be things that would hurt or, physically be traumatic for her, then she herself had another alter form to take over that experience. Like there were some molestations and other types of things, and there were actually several alters that formed to take over specific types of situations. And you can see all that in the alter chart. Then there's another alter family that was formed that was called the occult family, and that was for her ritual abuse experiences. The head of that family was named herself Angelique, and Angelique had several alters underneath her who took over various types of trauma that when she underwent various types of abuse during her ritual abuse experiences. And then there was a third alter family that was just composed of one alter, and that was an alter that formed when Jenny was a preteen. She was gang raped. JJ took over when she was leaving junior high school and got herself into a gang rape situation. And this alter that was formed then calls herself Vanessa, and she thinks of herself as a Latino. It's very interesting with Vanessa. One time when Jenny was older, and Vanessa took over when Jenny was walking into a bar, and she looked at herself in the mirror, and she actually saw what at least her mind saw, the personage of Vanessa rather than Jenny herself in the mirror. And that happened again to Jenny when she was in the Utah State Hospital under treatment. She had a suicidal alter called Janet who took over. And when Jenny looked in the mirror when she was in the hospital, and this Janet was in charge at the time, her mind saw this little girl who, with pigtails, who called herself Janet. So it's very interesting what our mind does, to protect ourselves. But these alters came out with Jenny, and they decided what they looked like. They decided what hair color they had. Her eyes actually changed color, and this is very common with multiple personalities, is that their eyes will change different colors depending on what alter, is present in the body at the time.
You mean her eyes physically changed colors?
Physically changed color, yes.
Wow.
when Jenny was in the state hospital, what happened is Jenny grew up, and she became a nurse, a very brilliant person. She got almost straight A's in school, and she became a nurse, and she went for a nursing job interview at the Utah State Psychiatric Hospital. During her nursing job interview, she changed personalities, and she ended up an inpatient, at the hospital. And she stayed there for a year in inpatient care voluntarily and received care, and that's when most of her altered personalities, they felt safe. They could come forth and tell their experiences, and so they came forth, and that's when we defined most of her altered personalities was at the Utah State Psychiatric Hospital. But I was talking about back there, back in 1980 when Michelle Remembers came out. Michelle was an adult, but as a young child, 6-year-old child, she was ritually abused by the satanic coven. And after she grew up, some of these memories started to come back, and she went to a doctor, psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Lawrence Pazder, and received counseling. And Dr. Pazder and Michelle wrote her biography, Michelle Remembers, back in 1980, and it came out and it became a bestseller. But what was interesting about that was that when it became so popular, the story of this little girl that was a multiple personality who had been ritually abused, all of a sudden just literally thousands of ritual abuse survivors started to come out of the woodwork, both in Canada and the United States, and they went to therapists and they went to legal entities and said, they had been ritually abused just as Michelle had been ritually abused. And that caused what some people defined as the satanic panic, where, all these people were saying they were ritually abused, but it was actually because these survivors were, speaking out and saying, this is going on, and we have a really huge problem in this country, and we do. And as a result of that, there were several things that happened. One was there was an organization formed called the International Society for the Study of ISSTD. It was a study of dissociation. It was essentially therapists who had all these people come to them and say that they were ritually abused. Well, they couldn't find treatment modules for them because the American Psychiatric Association didn't have them and refused to recognize the multiple personality diagnosis. And so this ISSTD formed. It was composed of, there's literally over 100 therapists in there, and they treat ritual abuse survivors, and they're on the internet, and they have, a very good website. But that formed back in the early 1980s. And another thing that happened was that I'm from Utah, and it's the headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Well, here in Utah, the church has, not only in Utah, but across the United States and across the world, they have what they call family services. It's a counseling arm. Well, they started all these LDS people that had been ritually abused also started going to LDS family services and saying they had been ritually abused. Well, the president of the church at the time was Ezra Taft Benson. Brother Benson was, he used to be Secretary of Agriculture under Dwight D. Eisenhower, but at the time he was president of the LDS Church. And he was hearing from LDS Family Services that all these people were coming forth saying they'd been ritually abused. Well, also, President Benson was from Idaho, and he was from a little tiny town in Idaho. And at the very same time in Idaho, there was a ritually abused baby found in a garbage can. Of course, it was the body of a baby. It had been partially burned, and the organs were missing. It had been a ritually abused baby. And they didn't ever find the perpetrators, but the state of Idaho because of this, they call it Baby X. They passed what they call the Baby X law. And the Baby X law was the first ritual abuse law in the United States. Well, all this publicity was going on about this Baby X at the same time that these ritual abuse survivors were going to LDS Social Services. So President Benson formed a committee. It was a 12-person committee, and they were charged with going out and interviewing ritual abuse survivors. And so they did that. It was headed by Elder Glenn Pace. He was a part of the first presidency of the presiding bishopric. They went and interviewed all these ritual abuse survivors. I was given the only interview Elder Pace has ever given on what they call the 1990 LDS Ritual Abuse Report. President Pace told me that they interviewed over 100 survivors, and he could have interviewed 3 times as many had he had the time. But in the report, you can find it on the internet, but in the report that he writes to President Benson, he says that 45 members witnessed human sacrifice, and they actually hired a genealogist, and the genealogist traced the perpetrators that were being named. See, ritual abuse tends to come down in what we call multi-generational satanic families, and I can go into the history of that later. We actually believe it started with Cain and comes down all through history and goes through Hitler and all the things, bringing Nazis into the U.S. and all this other thing with the CIA mind control program. But because they found all these perpetrators, they traced the history, and they excommunicated members of the church that they knew were ritually abusers. And then they turned over that information to the Utah Attorney General. Well, at the very same time they were doing this year-long ritual abuse report in the church, the Utah State Legislature also became very concerned about all these ritual abuse survivors that were saying, all this satanic stuff is going on in the state. And so they formed a committee, and it was co-chaired by Dr. Noemi Mattis. She has her PhD as well as her JD. Now, Noemi was also present at the forming of this International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, ISSTD, back in the 1980s. And she headed this committee. They went out and they interviewed people all over Utah that were saying that they were ritually abused. They interviewed police officers, they interviewed counselors and therapists and so forth. And they also had a report. So they combined these 2 reports, and they hire ritual abuse investigators at the Utah Attorney General's office. And that's where I came into the story, is that the very first arrest of these ritual abuse investigators was the father of these 2 women that came to me. And they said, we've been ritually abused. We have these memories coming back. They were cousins, and they hadn't seen each other since childhood. And after this one man's arrest, they happened to run into each other at one of the local malls here, and they realized that they were starting to have some of the very same memories come back of their childhood, and that they were at the same murders, and they were, they had been sexually abused by their fathers, and all these different things were going on. And they says the ritual abuse investigators aren't looking into our allegations. They're only charging him with abuse of one of the sisters. And so we would like you, Judy, to go with us. We want to go back out to these satanic coven sites where we were abused as children. We want to put together what information we can and take it up to the ritual abuse investigators. So that's where I came into the story. I took these women. We spent about a year, and we went to different sites around here, and where they had been abused. And it was very interesting because
where did they take you, Judy? Where were these sites at?
They were in various towns around Utah that they had been abused, and they were private properties owned by Satanic Coven members. It's a very tight-knit group. We gathered this information, and I wanted to say that, these memories start to come back through triggers. The adult survivor of abuse will smell, see, have something remind them of their childhood abuse, and then the memories, that electrical circuit will connect the memory to the core personality, and these memories will start to come back in bits and pieces. They usually come back in nightmares, and then those nightmares, become more and more vivid and more detailed until a full memory comes back. And it was really interesting with these two is that we would go out to a site and look at the various things, and then we would go home, and then individually they would call me and say, this is what I remember. And as I talked to them, and they hadn't talked to each other about the experience, but as I talked to them individually, they had exact details of the murders and exact details of the victim and who was there and da-da-da, da-da-da.
Now, so these murders were also children, correct?
Yeah, it's mainly children that they murder, yeah. And with them, this particular coven, and I think it's quite common with satanic covens, they were blue-eyed blondes. That they seem to want specific types of victims, and those were the children that were blue-eyed blondes. Some were babies. Some were children about the same ages as these women were when they saw the murder. They really planned these murders out to traumatize the children. They purposely do it to mind control them into multiple personalities so that they can control these people for the rest of their lives through the multiple personalities. So as these memories came back and we gathered all this information, then I took it back to the Utah Attorney General Satanic Ritual Abuse Investigators. The sad thing was that we had the trial on the man. They didn't ever use the information that we gave them. They didn't charge him with anything else. He got off on a quirk of the law, and he's still out there doing his thing, as are the other members of the coven who have done all this stuff to these women. And that was the sad part of it. The other relatively good part of the situation is that I was very, very frustrated by them not doing anything with this information. And so I started to take it to different legal entities, and one of the people I took it to was the local FBI agent. The very same day that I took this to the agent, asking them to open up a case, Jenny Hill had approached this very same agent this very same day. And Jenny Hill was a woman who grew up in Garden Grove, California, and she was ritually abused down in Garden Grove she says by her father and by a satanic coven down there that was directed by a person who is referred to as Dr. Green, who is thought to be part of the CIA mind control program. But anyway, Jenny approached this FBI agent and asked that she was trying to find the parents of a little girl that she saw murdered when she was 6 years old. And so the FBI agent took both of our information. He went back to his superiors. He came back to us and said, I'm sorry, but they won't let me open up a case. However, I will put you together with this Jenny Hill that approached me also, because I think you could help her.
Why wouldn't they? Did he tell you why they wouldn't let him open a case?
I think that is very political.
Somebody was pulling strings from behind the scenes.
Well, he said that there's a report out by an FBI agent by the name of Kenneth Lanning that says that ritual abuse isn't going on. I researched that report, and so did Pamela Sue Perskins, who is the author of a book called Ritual Abuse 2000. It's kind of like an encyclopedia of ritual abuse. It's a very well-written book by her and her husband. He's a PhD. Anyway, she interviewed someone at the FBI headquarters, and I also called the FBI headquarters and talked to them about this landing report. What we found, and it's published in their book also, is that this landing report, he did not represent the FBI when he made that report, and he was put into early retirement after that report came out on the Internet. And it's essentially a report that says ritual abuse doesn't exist, and the FBI says it doesn't exist. But the FBI claims that they don't have anything to do with that report. So why I was told that that was the reason why they couldn't open up a case for me, I don't know. I just know that they wouldn't open it up, and nor would they open up one for Jenny. But they did put us together. And that's when I started talking to Jenny, and she asked me to write her biography, and we spent 20 years together going through her life history and researching her life history, and that's the story behind my writing, 22 Faces.
Well, this satanic ritual abuse, it has been going on for a long time, and it is currently going on, isn't it?
It certainly is, and the biggest problem we have in our society is that we deny that it's happening. The problem is happening to little children who cannot talk for themselves. You know, they are being abused, they are being traumatized into multiple personalities, and they can't, help themselves. So this has been my life's mission, is to expose this whenever possible. And I really appreciate you asking me to be on your show so that we can talk about it, because people don't want to hear about it. They don't want to hear that children are being kidnapped and raped and murdered, but it's all over the place. Since I started coming out, working with these women and having ritual abuse survivors come to me, and when my book was published, we were on the Dr. Phil show and literally had hundreds and hundreds of ritual abuse survivors contact me. Since that happened, there are so many people that have approached me that said, I'm being ritually abused. I used to live in Orem, Utah, and I knew 20 in my immediate neighborhood who had undergone ritually abused. Now I'm living out in Saratoga Springs, and I know of at least 5 that are within walking distance of my home out here.
Now, these children that are being sacrificed, where do they get these children from? Are they kidnapped children? Are they somebody's parent offers them up? Where do they get them?
All of the above. They will kidnap them. They will more than often produce their own. They will impregnate their own children and have the baby early, and then use the baby as a sacrifice.
I actually heard a survivor of this say that she was impregnated, and then they actually sacrificed the baby as she was giving birth before the umbilical cord was cut.
Well, that's a very common story with ritual abuse survivors, unfortunately. Is I've heard many tell me that they were impregnated, usually by their fathers. The baby was taken early, and they never saw it again, or they were made to watch their own baby being killed on the altar.
It's all about trauma, isn't it?
It's all about trauma. They will take runaway girls. They will impregnate them. They will, get the babies, and they will kill both the girl and the baby at the same time. That's a common practice to do at Christmas time in a manger scene. They have all these elaborate things that they do to make it look like it's so unreal. They will give these children drugs, so they're in a drug-like state, so the memories, come back. When they come back, they're, really fuzzy, like, you would be if you were highly drugged. They do very elaborate things to to make it appear that this hasn't happened. But we have been able to trace 5 of the children that these 2 women that I was working with claimed they saw killed. We have been able to trace them and actually spot the victims. And even at that, I haven't been able to get cases. Some of them I haven't even been able to get cases open, although I did work with the Utah Attorney General Special Investigators, Head of Special Investigations for several years, Detective Hostler, and he did reopen a Rachel Runyon case here in Utah as a little girl who was taken from a playground, kidnapped from a playground. And he did reopen that case, but they still have not prosecuted the people that we feel have done it, because one of the biggest problems we have with this whole situation is that the memories come back 20, 30 years later. There is no evidence that a crime occurred. Often they can't define who the victim was, especially if it's a baby that's been born without a birth certificate. And so the normal process of our court system is to, work on the evidence until you can build a case. Well, when there's no evidence, when the body's gone, they'll eat the organs of the child, they'll burn the bones, they'll crush them up in bone crushers, they'll throw body parts in the middle of the lakes, they'll do everything in the world that you'll never find, the body again. So there's no evidence, to work on there's no crime scene to work on, because it'll all be cleaned up, within a few minutes of having the ceremony. They'll have the crime scene all taken care of, and the body disappears.
Kind of
so it's
like
very,
Planned Parenthood, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's some stories about Planned Parenthood, too, about securing, babies from Planned Parenthood for some of these satanic ceremonies. But the problem in our society is the denial. People don't want to hear about this. People don't want to talk about it. Investigators don't want to investigate it because it's so difficult. Judges don't want to deal with it in court. They don't even want the word satanic brought into court. And so perpetrators are able to get away with it, and they know they can. And so it just continues on. These covens have satanic ceremonies on an almost monthly basis. And whenever you see these kids in high school playing with the satanic stuff, they really need to be sat down and talked to, because playing around with satanic stuff just gets them in deeper and deeper and deeper until they can't get out. I heard of one boy who was part of a satanic coven, and he was a teenager, and he went to the police and told about what was going on, and the next thing we knew, he was used as one of the victims in their ceremonies. They're very adept at what they do, and they make sure that they're not going to get caught. There are people involved very, very high up, very politically high up.
I personally feel that it is completely covered up and controlled by the courts and the government, because they're heavily involved in it.
There are some, unfortunately, that are. There are some very, very good investigators. There are some very, very good judges. There are others who are involved, and they work for the coven.
Yep.
There's a lot of money involved. When we get into the Pope Francis stuff and Kevin Annette's investigation that he's done, you realize how high it really goes across the globe. It's pretty scary.
Well, I have to tell you, when the Pope landed in the United States, since he's been here, I have been very sick, nauseous and dizzy. I just feel like something awful is around me. And I can't, I think it has to do with his presence, to tell you the truth.
Well, I get nauseous just thinking of the denial that's going on, that he and others in high places are involved in this, and people are refusing to take a look at it. The press appears to be completely controlled, and the news just is not getting out that this is going on. As a society, it's going to ruin us unless we...
Well, he does not hide the fact that he follows Satan. His staff has the satanic Baphomet design on it. He wears a crucifix on a chain that has the hammer and the crescent, which means communism. He's not hiding it. I just read an article this morning that he was going around the White House telling guests that the Quran and the Bible are both the same thing. Jesus, Allah, it's all the same. That's what he was saying.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about, my background with what I think is going on at the Vatican.
Okay, I'd appreciate that.
Want to get into that? A couple of years ago, there was a video that came out on the Internet. It was an interview that Kevin Annett gave to a therapist over in Holland by the name of Toss Ninjas. And Toss was a ritual abuse survivor. And she was talking about, being at satanic ceremonies and some very highly political high-ups were at the perpetrators of these ceremonies. And I became very excited because we have a video out of Jenny Hill, who is the woman I worked, who's the subject of 22 Faces. In the video of Jenny's, she talks about this having to watch a child sacrifice, and what Toss was saying in her interview with Kevin Annett was much the same as Jenny. So I was able to get a hold of Kevin Annett, and I have been so impressed with this man and what he has done. Kevin Annett is a pastor from Canada who was put up into a little place up in, I think it was British Columbia, that had a lot of Indian tribal people in his parish there. And he noticed that none of the Indians were coming to church. There were just, a few white people coming. And so he got to know the Indian people quite well, and he found out the reason why they weren't coming is because back in the late 1800s, the Canadian government made a pact with the Roman Catholic Church, mainly, and other churches in Canada, where they would start residential schools for children, and there were like 80 residential schools across Canada that they established. They would take kids as young as 4 or 5 years old, and make them attend these residential schools. But what was the problem was they weren't really schools. They were kind of like torture chambers. There were 50,000 children that are missing from these residential schools. And that is the reason why Kevin Annett couldn't get people to come to his church up there, was because the Indians say, they take our children, and, what kind of church, is that would, kill our children? And so Kevin started work with the different Indian tribes in Canada to get these cases into court of all these missing children. I mean, they were children that were tortured and thrown out windows, and all kinds of horrible things were coming out. And he tried to get the cases into court. Well, one of the cases he was trying to get into court was that there was on October the 10th, 1964, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip visited the Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia, and they took a bunch of children out on a picnic. Then they took 10 children, and notice this 10, 10, 10 here. We have October, which is the 10th month, October the 10th, 1964, and those four numbers add up to 1010. They take 10 children from this picnic, and the children are never seen again. All the children are around the age of 10, and their parents have never seen their children since they left with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Well, there were two witnesses to that kidnapping of children, and they were they had those witnesses on tape about the kidnapping. Well, when he couldn't get any case, he couldn't get any of the Canadian courts to take the case. And so he went over to Brussels. He went to a firm in New York, a law firm in New York, and then he went over to Brussels and he formed the International Common Law Court of Justice in Brussels. He took many of these cases to that court. They spent that court has been going now for, it's 2012. It's been going for 3 years now. The first case they went through, they actually convicted Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, and I think there were 33 other global elites that they convicted in that court for various crimes against children. Well, these two witnesses to this kidnapping of Queen Elizabeth, before the court happened, they died of very mysterious causes. And after that court, one of the people that they convicted in that court was Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Ratzinger. Well, a few days before they came out with that conviction, all of a sudden Ratzinger resigns from office because he had been presented with all this evidence about him being at child sacrifices
And I had heard that he was offered a deal that either he would go to jail or he had to resign, and that's why he resigned.
That could possibly be. I don't know that information, but that could possibly be because his resignation was just a few days before they announced their verdict. There were 6 judges and 36 juror members, international court. And they spent several months in litigation. I think it was it was 4 or 5 months in litigation before they made that determination. But so there you have, the Vatican involved in child sacrifices. Well, part of that litigation was they were able to get out of the Vatican archives a couple of documents. And one of the documents was called Solicitanus. And what it was essentially was said that before someone is crowned pope, they participate in a child sacrifice. And that's an actual court document that's been filed in court that is from the Vatican archives. And then you have these witnesses that were actually there with Pope Ratzinger and Pope Francis at child sacrifices. And they have testified before the IPCCS court. And I have heard witnesses also talk about being present when Queen Elizabeth down in Australia was at a child sacrifice. So there are, all these witnesses coming forth and saying these things. They've been litigated through a court that has valid judges and certified jury members, and yet you don't see it in the mainstream media. Kevin Annett has dedicated his life to get this information out to the public, and yet there are a few of us that have been able to get it into, some internet newspapers and things like this. But as far as the mainstream media picking up on these stories, they simply don't do it.
I hear you, sister. I've told people about this, and they tell me, oh, I don't believe that. You'd have to prove that to me. And I'd say, well, give me your email address. I'll send you the document. I'll send you the court documents. They're right there on the internet. And they won't give me their email address. They don't want to believe this.
People don't want to believe. It's too easy to sit in your shell and not believe it. But what we're trying to do is inform people that this is going on because children are being killed. Children are being tortured. Children are being kidnapped. Children are going through this, and they're not going to be able to be helped unless people recognize that it's going on.
Well, I'll tell you, the children that are being tortured believe it. And like you said, it's not going to stop if people don't bring it out and make it stop.
Yeah, they're not. But it really goes back through history. Cain himself was known as the master Mahan, and Maha in Hebrew means to destroy. With the N added, it means Mahan, which means mind destroyer. And Mahan in Arabic means a keeper of great secrets. There was an ancient pagan tribe called the Quintus tribe, and there was a historian in the first century Jewish historian called Flavius Josephus. He wrote about the ancient pagan Quintus tribe, and they were believed to be descendants of Cain. They claimed to be descendants of Cain. And on they had a mark that they put on their forehead or their hand in honor of Cain, and it was called the mark of Cain. And it was an equal-sided cross. And this cross is seen in all throughout history. It was called the mark of the beast. You'll see it in the Bible. The Aztec cross temple. There's actually a temple down in South America called the Cross Temple, and it has on it an actual cross. And as you know, the Aztecs were a great believer in human sacrifice. But it's called the Aztec Cross Temple, and it was above the sacrificial altar. The Greek letter chi is a cross, and the Greeks also believed in human sacrifice. Many cultures used human sacrifice throughout history, and the swastika itself was said to come from the Chinese symbol, which is a symbol of Satan worship, which is a equilateral cross with the arms bent. Hitler bent the arms of the cross to make his swastika. But you see this history of these sacrificial ceremonies, satanic ceremonies all through history, and yet we tend to believe, oh, that's back in history. That isn't going on now. But yet we know that this has been practiced throughout history. Like I said earlier, the families, satanic families, they tend to be multi-generational, where it's mainly the father will abuse
his own son and condition them.
Yeah, their own children. They will do that. Sometimes it's just the oldest child to cover it up. Like in Jenny's case, she was the oldest child, and the other children, as far as we know of, weren't bothered, but they tortured her, and now that she's grown up and gone, her own family doesn't believe that this happened to her.
And these children that they sacrifice, they don't just take them in and kill them. They actually torture them before they kill them, because the fear that does something to their blood, and they get some kind of a charge out of it. Am I correct?
Yes. In fact, in 22 Faces, it talks about the satanic ceremony that Jenny's ceremony that she went to at age 6, where she saw the other little girl killed. She was actually supposed to be killed herself. There were 2 altars. It was kind of like a double ceremony. And in there it talks about the different tortures that she was made to go through, and how each torture formed a different altar personality to cover the memory of that particular torture. I know it's sickening to think about, but this is actually going on, and something that people need to understand that's happening. Like I say, it's all throughout history, and it's clear down here to us. I think in the United States we became more acquainted with it through the CIA mind control program. After World War II, there were a lot of Nazis imported into the U.S., and unfortunately many of those were for the CIA mind control program. Project Paperclip, which is very easy to find on the internet. But they actually had 182 projects at 80 different universities under Project Paperclip. And this was a mind control program not on adults, it was on children. They were studying mind control to develop super spies. And they actually had parents would donate their children, not donate, they were paid, for the children to be in this program, or they would kidnap children and put them in the program. But a lot of these ritual abuse survivors are a result of the CIA mind control program. There is a person in the program called a Dr. Green, and how we know about Dr. Green is that in the forward to my book, 22 Faces, was written by Dr. Colin Ross. And Dr. Colin Ross is this eminent psychiatrist. He's one of the foremost well-known psychiatrists in the world. He was once president of ISSTD, and in the foreword, he talks about how Dr. Green was a 17-year-old Jewish turncoat who was actually a Jewish boy in the concentration camps that was put into the mind control program, and he survived the camps by becoming a perpetrator. They brought him over here into the U.S., and he actually headed the mind control program. How we know that is that we had two hearings, 1995 and 1977, on the CIA mind control program that was done by these Nazi doctors in these universities and different government institutions across the United States and Canada. And on the internet are some videos of some of the witnesses testifying at the 1995 congressional hearings. Well, all three of the witnesses that testify in this one hearing talk about Dr. Green. And one of the witnesses was a little girl at the time, and she was actually put in a cage by his office. And at one point, she was able to get out of the cage when he wasn't there, and she looked through the files in his office and came across some papers that showed Dr. Green was head of the program, and he was paid, so many thousands of dollars to run this program. I think it was $40,000 to run this program. But this Dr. Green has been described by other ritual abuse survivors. There's a study out by Dr. Corydon Hammond of the University of Utah Medical Center. He also was one of these initial founders of the ISSTD back in the 1980s. Well, when they were forming the ISSTD, Hammond was there, and he got together with I think it was 8 other therapists, and they did an 8-year study of their clients who, they were ritually abused clients. And I can't remember these percentages, but I think it was like 65% of them said that they were abused by this Dr. Green. And they describe him as a small man, had a limp in his left leg, used a cane, had balding brown hair, and had a German accent. Well, when I was talking to Jenny about her abuser who would come over to this little corner house and abuse her, she described the very same person as is in this study, this Dr. Green, as being over her abuse. And he would direct the abuse, and, he knew how to form altars in children, and they're formed through torture and whatever. They get the children on a certain wavelength in their brain, and then they torture them at that wavelength, and that brings forth an altar, and then they'll give that altar a Latin name, the purpose of that is that when that person is older and a person knows that they have been ritually abused, they could call out that Latin name and actually call the altar forward. The altar will take over the body, and that way they can control that person. That's how mind control works. That's the purpose of mind control, is to, control a person. And they control it through the formation of altars.
Judy, a lot of the targets that I have talked to over the years have told me that they felt that their parents sold them into this program.
Yes, I've heard that also.
Yeah, and then the thing is, it's so similar to what you're talking about, because the abuse that a target goes through is constant trauma, constant abuse of your animals, your home, violation of your privacy, just constantly destroying anything that you're trying to build up, they tear down. And then on top of it, the microwave weapons and the lasers, I feel the lasers are some form of a lobotomy, because they're always on the temple, the right temple of your forehead.
Well, I know that people have been electronically accessed, some of them on the temple, some of them on different parts of their body. I was at a conference back in Connecticut a couple of years ago. I spoke back there, and there was a survivor that also spoke back there, and you could actually see an electronic device that had been implanted in her arm, and you could actually feel it. They have much more sophisticated techniques now where they microchip people,
yes,
and are able to electronically access them.
But what makes me angry is when people, they say, oh, there's no such thing, and blah, blah, blah. But, if you go to Freedom Fighters for America, there is a medical section in that website, and there's evidence. There are x-rays. There are implants that show up. Even when you have irrefutable evidence, again, people just want to say, oh, I don't believe this.
Well, the survivors certainly believe it, and I really honor those who are willing to speak out and talk about it. They have been through so much throughout their life, but yet they are willing to speak out and try to help those that are
suffering. And it's the same scenario. If we don't, I don't care how many people want to say you're crazy and I don't believe it. I could care less. I'm going to stand up and tell the truth, and if you don't like it, there's the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out.
Yeah. Yes. You really have to admire these ritual abuse survivors. There's a lot of books out, a lot of biographies like Jenny's out by ritual abuse survivors who, tell their story. And they're really brave in doing so, but somebody has to do it, and that's how I think we're going to get this information out, is through the survivors. They're certainly not going to take it into court.
Okay, we have a guest on the phone that has raised their hand, would like to ask a question.
Okay.
Good evening, Ohio. How are you?
Pretty good. My question.
Would like to ask Judy a question?
Yes, I would. This is a very interesting program tonight. My question is, once this trial took place overseas and the people were found guilty, what happened to the punishment, and how would you even expect these people to receive any punishment? This is what gets me. I understand who they are and how high they are up and in management and running the country. How could we ever expect them to get any punishment as would be normal with the average John and Judy Joe?
And that's a good point. And unfortunately, I don't think there is a lot of hope that they'll ever be punished for it. Kevin Annett right now he's working with Interpol police, and he has an arrest warrant out for Pope Francis. And he was going to try to get it served while the Pope was here in the U.S. I don't think he's got much chance of doing that, but at least he's trying.
Yeah, that's interesting, how he can just come here and everybody's renting buses and running to New York and running to Philadelphia. Oh, we've got to see him, and here you have documentation that proves that he sacrificed a child just to become a pope.
Right.
It's insanity.
And not just that, there are 8 survivors who testified that he had raped them. There's 8 different survivors that testified at the court that Pope Francis had raped them.
It's disgusting. And I can't even stand turning the TV on right now and seeing anything about him being here. Immediately I start getting nauseous. It's just disgusting. People need to wake up.
He raped them as children. These are child rapes. They're not, not even adult rapes. Innocent children.
Do you have anything else to ask, Ohio?
No, not right now.
Okay, well, thank you. Great question, hon.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to read something by Carol Roots. Carol Roots is a ritual abuse survivor, and she wrote this book, A Nation Betrayed, back in 2001. And it says, the CIA brought my services at the tender age of 4 from my grandfather in 1952. Over the next 12 years, I was tested, trained, and used in various ways. Electroshock, drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other types of trauma were used to make me compliant and split my personality, or create multiple personalities for specific tasks. Each alter or personality was created to respond to a post-hypnotic trigger, then perform an act and not remember it later. This Manchurian Candidate program was just one of the operational uses of the mind control scenario by the CIA. Thousands of innocent children who have now grown into adults are silently suffering from the effects of these experiments. Guess what? They used your hard-earned tax dollars to support this. And this is something that really infuriates me, is that CIA is doing this to children right now and today, and we have hundreds of testimonies from survivors that say they have been through it. In Kevin Annette's book, Hidden No Longer, he talks about the children up in Canada in provincial hospitals that were used in these CIA mind control experiments. We have Jenny Hill's story. That was CIA mind control. There is a survey out called the 2004 Extreme Abuse Surveys, and it's on the Internet. And in there, I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but there's literally hundreds of survivors that have been part of this CIA mind control program. On the website, I have 2 websites. One is 22faces.com, where you can get my book. The other website is Child Abuse Recovery. On the Child Abuse Recovery website, there is a petition to have another investigate. We're trying to work with congressmen and get this is a petition to investigate again the CIA mind control of children. I'm asking listeners to go into that petition and sign it. You just have to make a little click. But and if you go into that petition and you go into the first 50 comments, this petition was actually started by ritual abuse survivors, and read those first 50 comments in that petition. They are very, very interesting comments because they talk about being abused by the CIA. One is a Donna Joy Plattner from Omaha, Nebraska. She says, I am a targeted individual being attacked with direct energy weapons, and I am a human subject to a military electronic experiment funded by our government. I have been in it since I was a toddler. And another person in there is Elsa E. from Moab, Utah. She says, I am a survivor of government-sponsored trauma and torture in a covert mind control program. I had no life of my own and continue to struggle for freedom of mind and body in deprogramming. The CIA program that we are funding with our tax dollars is still traumatizing children. And it's something that we need to do something about. I encourage the listeners to please go in and sign this petition. And when we get enough signatures on it, then we can take it to Congress and see if they'll do another investigation of the CIA mind program. Like I say, they've had 2 congressional hearings, one in 1995 and one in 1977. Both congressional hearings, even after hearing ritual abuse survivor stories, they would not release the information to the public. They closed it down. They said they closed down the MK Ultra program, which was started, when they brought in all these Nazi doctors after World War II. They said they closed that program down. But it appears to still be going on because you're still getting these survivors coming out and saying, I was in that program, I was mind-controlled, I was tortured as a child in that program. And
all they did was pretend to close it down and change the name. You have another caller that would like to ask a question.
Okay.
Welcome to the call, Arizona. You would like to ask Judy a question?
Yes, Judy. How does a person know if they have a history of this? What are some of the symptoms that you should look for if you have been the victim of ritual abuse?
Okay. There are a lot of indications. Panic attacks, sleep problems, feeling very much alone, isolating self from others, anxieties that you don't know where the anxiety is coming from, fears that you don't know where the fears are coming from, withdrawal from society. Continual depression is a good indicator. Nightmares. These memories come back in nightmares, and they usually start coming in bits and pieces, and then it's not just a nightmare. It's a nightmare that is over and over and over and has the same details in it, and the details become more and more clear as the nightmare reoccurs. There's learning problems, achieving problems. Often an abuse survivor will abuse alcohol or drugs, and one of the reasons for this is that throughout childhood these children are given drugs before they're taken to these ceremonies or before they're abused, and so some of them are addicted to drugs. Trouble planning ahead. Suicidal thoughts is a big one. They actually program suicidal thoughts into you. Blank periods is another big one, because blank periods is where the alters will take over and you won't remember from one day to the next or 1 minute to the next what happened in between. Can't remember your childhood.
Let me ask you real quick. Are the victims prone to, allow people to walk on them and abuse them?
Sometimes there's that capacity to want that. You'll find that with any abused child situation, where the abuse itself has made them feel like they are not worthy of love, or they're not worthy of being a good person, or they're not worthy of having a happy life, and they deserve to be abused because they have done or seen things that they know are wrong.
This is one of the things that I find a pattern with targets, that they know that they're letting someone take advantage of them or abuse them, but they don't understand why they let them, and they don't have the capability to speak up and stop it.
Right. And there's a lot of other symptoms, too, like self-mutilation is one. Flinching or spasms is another. Loses time is a big one. Headaches is a big one. Because as these alters take over, these electrical circuits connect and disconnect, and it actually will cause a headache. I know every time Jenny has a altar change, she has, it just wears her out. Her energy just zaps out, and she has an extreme headache afterward. Changes of voice and appearance, which means an altar is taken over. Avoiding social situations. There's a lot of fears, like I know a lot of survivors that it's even difficult for them to go into, say, a grocery store or other place where there's a lot of people because there's so many fears of, the people around them.
What about when they do attend a social situation? I have had targets tell me, I don't want to go to that Christmas party, or I don't want to go to that family dinner because I just don't feel like I'm part of it. They feel isolated and left out of it.
Right, isolation and disconnected from other people. They don't feel normal because they haven't had a normal life, and so they feel very victimized, and they will isolate themselves because they don't want other people to know. And a lot of it is guilt, because they will take a child and they will make them participate in the murder, or they will make them sexually abuse other children, and so they'll be made to do a lot of things that they know are wrong. They'll feel very guilty about it, and so they'll want to isolate themselves so that nobody will find out what a bad person they are because of the abuse they've been through. Plus, they are often told during the abuse that they are bad. They're so bad. You don't deserve to be loved. You don't deserve to breathe. You don't deserve to do anything because you were a bad person. They will do anything to tear down their ego, and it's all over control. Perpetrators, that's what they want, is power and control over that person. So they will do anything they can think of to denigrate that person.
Now, you said earlier, Judy, that parents actually sell their child to these people sometimes.
Yes.
Are they aware? Are these parents aware of what they're selling their child into?
Well, they're part of the abuse themselves. They are perpetrators. That's part of the culture that they have grown up in or are part of. These aren't ceremonies that are held once a year. These are things that are done on almost a daily basis.
So it's generally the parents that are part of this group.
Yeah, they'll be part of their own little groups. They'll have their own little groups, but they're also part of the overall satanic philosophy. See, what they believe is if we satanic people believe in worshiping both God and Satan. They believe that it gives them power. So you will see those people try to work their way up in high church positions, for instance, and then they will do the satanic stuff on the side. The victims call it day church and night church. They will go to regular church, and then at night they will go to the satanic church, and they, for some reason, they feel like they have more power. Well, of course, if they're big wigs in the community or wherever, and then they can also do this on the side and get away with it. It gives them a feeling of power, and that's what it's all about. They're also addicted to sex, the sexual abuse of children. They're very addicted to drugs, sexual abuse, anything that gives them a big high. There's a lot of pornography. There's snuff films involved. They'll film the murders of the children. Then they'll get big bucks for showing these snuff films to other satanic worshipers. And they'll have these big sex orgies. They always have a sex orgy before the sacrifice or before the snuff film showing. And there's a lot of money involved because they'll actually pay to go to these satanic ceremonies. They have to pay to see the child sacrificed. And so there's a lot of money involved in the whole thing. And people make a lot of money off of satanic worship.
I always knew that churches had a lot of perpetrators in them, and I was checking out into connections, and I remember that one serial killer from California. He was a deacon in the church.
Yeah, that'd be very common for a perpetrator.
You know, and some of his victims were women in the church. He would profile them at church, and then he would check out, you know, their home and who was around them. And what a better way to find, you know, and people go to church and they trust their brother and sister. And, of course, they're going to say, well, I live alone and church is all I have, you know. So what a perfect way to find a victim.
Right, uh-huh.
You know,
and
so we have to be aware of what's going on around us and not so trusting.
Right.
Well, do you ever think they're going to do something to these popes?
They are getting out the publicity on it as much as they can. I think there is so much power involved. This is called the Ninth Circle Satanic Child Sacrifice Cult, and it's composed of global leaders. I don't think that...
Cheney and Bush were found guilty also, correct?
Excuse me, I couldn't hear all you said.
Dick Cheney and George Bush were found guilty also, correct?
I haven't seen those names in the actual printout. See, there's been two trials going on, and then they got in the middle of this third one and decided they needed more investigation, and so they've been under investigation for the last year. So they haven't. I know that they're looking into those people, but I don't think that they've actually taken them through trial yet. I haven't seen those names in the judicial printout yet, but I know that they're looking into it.
Now the Queen and they were served these arrest warrants, and they laughed at them, correct?
Well, yeah. They did. They just completely ignored them. And one time, Kevin, there's been like 17 different witnesses that have disappeared, just been taken out one way or the other. There's over 2,000 witnesses, however, that have testified. But there has been a hit out on the judges and jury members itself. That was one of the reasons they went into hiding in 2014 because the Vatican had put a hit out from their mafia arm. I can't pronounce. It's called non grata. Or it's called Octopus or Non Grata. It's the Italian mafia. Put out a hit on the International Common Law Court of Justice judges and jury members. So they went into hiding, but they're still investigating. There's over 2,000 members of the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State, Kevin Annette's group, ITTCS. There's over 2,000 members worldwide, and they're still doing investigations on this for this third trial right now. But it hasn't started, and it probably won't for a while. They're being very careful in what they do. They have been able to make a few arrests, however, and they have been able to save some children. They found out that there was going to be a child sacrifice up in Montreal, and the children were held at Montreal University, which is an interesting university because it was used by what's the name of the doctor? He was head of the American Psychiatric Association, and he was a professor up at Montreal University, and there was a survivor by the name of Linda McDonald who sued them and won the lawsuit. And because of that lawsuit, they had the 1977 congressional hearings on the CIA mind control of children.
And that's when they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar.
Yeah. But up there at Montreal
That's
University...
when, isn't that was when President, Clinton came out and said, "I'm sorry that we tortured you."
Yeah, that was quite a few years later.
Yeah.
But,
we're so sorry that we tortured you. We won't do it anymore. And that was another one of the big lies.
But he didn't mention children either. You know, he was mentioning adults when he said that. They have never mentioned the thousands of children that they've tortured. They just talk about the adults. But back at Montreal, last year, they found out that there was going to be a sacrifice of children at a upper class home there in Montreal, and they were actually able to work with the police up there and disrupt the preparations for that sacrifice. They arrested 2 people. One of the persons asked for asylum, and they flew her over to Brussels, and from information that they got from her and other people, they were able to work with Interpol police, and they rescued several hundred Romanian children that were on their way to be sexually abused and sacrificed.
Now, several hundred, not all of these children get sacrificed. Some of them go on an auction block, and they're auctioned off to be sex slaves, correct?
Correct, Yeah, I've heard stories about that, too.
Either way, I mean, they're being tortured and abused.
Okay, now I know it was D. Ewan Cameron was the name of he was president of the American Psychiatric Association.
Ah,
and
Dr. Cameron. Yes, I've read articles about him.
Yeah. Well,
he's heavily involved in the MK Ultra program.
Yeah. But that lawsuit, they did win, although I don't think she ever collected any money from it, but it did lead to the 1977 congressional hearings.
And these universities are heavily involved in these programs.
They say they're not anymore, but they certainly have. There's more
yeah, they say they're not, but you know what? I caught 2 of them in my state that are involved in mine. So yes, they're involved.
Well, the latest child sacrifice that we have information on was back in February 22nd of 2014. 2 children were raped and killed as part of Pope Francis's cardinal inauguration of Quebec, Canada Archbishop Gerald Lacrosse. Witnesses claimed that they had seen the human sacrifice of a 5- or 6-year-old boy and a small girl. The killings were said to take place after midnight in the basement chambers of Jesuit headquarters at the Vatican next to the Church San Lorenzo Pobiscus in Rome. They testified that Lacrosse, Catholic Jesuit Superior General Adolfo Pachon, and Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Senior Cabinet Minister Dennis LaBelle participated in the rape and human sacrifices. The quote from Kevin Annette: "We received a report that the children were murdered in Catholic Jesuit headquarters. One source said a boy was sacrificed around midnight in the presence of Cardinal Lacrosse and Dennis LaBelle. Evidently later that evening, the top guy killed a small girl. By that, we assume he meant Jesuit Superior Adolfo Pachon." So this appears to be a regular occurrence at the Vatican, not only for the Pope inauguration, but for the inauguration of other people like cardinals there. It was 30 Romanian children that were targeted for human sacrifice that Interpol were able to seize. They seized 2 tons of drugs from child traffickers from 6 countries. And they arrested 1,027 mafia members. That happened back in September 25th, 2014. And that was on information that Kevin and Annette supplied them from these Montreal sacrifices that they were going to have. They were going to have these 2 children sacrificed in Montreal, and they were able to, disrupt the ceremony. But they weren't able to rescue the 2 children, however. But there's a lot of people involved, unfortunately. Some of the corporations involved was the food giant Cargill, Sinclair Oil, Cameco Uranium Corporation, Europe's convicted mafia money laundering bank HSBC, Pope Francis, Catholic Jesuit Superior General Adolphe Pachon, Quebec Archbishop Gerald Lacrosse, and over 40 other global elites were named as participants in child trafficking, rape, torture, and murder, human hunting parties, and Ninth Circle child sacrifice rites. And then I don't know if you want to get into the 12-mile club, but that's something else. Are you interested in that?
I think we got time. Why don't you explain it to us?
Okay. I'll just read what I've written here about it. On November 8, 2014, a International Common Law Court of Justice Court investigation was launched on the Vancouver, Canada child sacrificial cult referred to as the 12-Mile Club. Members were said to kidnap Aboriginal women and children, put them in their expensive yachts, abuse and kill them, then take the bodies outside Canada's 12-mile territorial limit to be disposed of in the ocean. There were possible ties of the 12-Mile Club to Cardinal Gerald Lacrosse of Quebec and Stephen Harper's government cabinet minister Dennis LaBelle. Others names of those connected to the 12-Mile Club were former British Columbia Provincial Court Chief Justice Hugh Stansfield, Justice William Essen, and Terence Warren of the British Columbia Supreme Court, United Church clergymen, including Church moderator Gary Patterson, and National United Church officials Brian Thorpe and John Jessamine. It just goes on and on. I've written articles about these, and they're so hard to do because there's so many people involved and so much to verify that you could write 12 books about it and not get into all the details. It's amazing what this international court has uncovered, yet it's not hitting the mainstream press, which is really, really sad.
Now, I've heard comments that people have said on the internet that court, that's not a real court, they said.
It is a valid court. It's obviously not the UN court. There's another court, international court, that's under the charge of the UN. But Kevin Annette has gone through the UN. He has gone through a law firm in New York, and he's had 6 judges who are valid. They're international judges from different countries, but they're appointed judges, and the jury members were all judicially appointed. It is a valid court, but it's not recognized by a lot of people because of the situation that we're in. A lot of our people in our court system here in the U.S. and in Canada and over in Europe, they're involved in this whole thing. We could go on and on about what's going on in the UK right now, but it goes all through their parliament and all through their judicial system, and they're members of this Ninth Circle satanic child sacrifice cult, and they cover for each other.
Well, and unfortunately, they got the people in control, don't they?
They do. They do. And it's a world that we really need to try to do what we can about it because it's ruining our society. It's a growth, it's a cancerous growth within our society that's just going to bring it down. unless we as moral people can get a hold of it and recognize it and try to do something about it.
How do we fight these people, Judy? I know that you have your petition. I have signed it, and I have posted it many times.
I appreciate that. I think that we start on the smaller levels. We try to be aware that children around us could be being abused, and we try to help them as much as possible. And I'd like to give a few indications of how to recognize an abused child. I worked in child welfare for many years, and I worked in protective services, and children who are being abused are not the ones that are going to come out and tell you they're being abused, because they're very much afraid of they're usually abused by people very close to them, and they're afraid of their environment, and so they're not going to come out and tell you. So it's us as adults have to recognize them and then try to do what we can to help them. But some of the indications of an abused child is that they make repetitive statements. They have compulsive behavior. Self-mutilation is a big sign. A person who's being abused feels like they have to hurt themselves because of all this guilt they feel, because they feel like they're supposed to be abused. You know, they're not worthy of being a good person. So self-mutilation is a big sign. Fearful reactions is another big sign. If they have unusual fears of everything, it's because they are fearful and they don't know where their next abuse situation is coming from. So they have very fearful reactions to things. You'll see flinching or spasms in the person. They're usually very shy children. They avoid social situations, very uncommunicative. They lose time. If they have a lot of forgetfulness, not just common forgetfulness, but just, big forgetfulness. And that's usually a sign that there's some alter in there, taking over. If they have headaches, and if those headaches are accompanied by changes of voice or changes in their appearance. There's a video on the internet with Jenny where she changes personalities, and you'll actually see a change in her appearance as she changes to the other, personality.
Is bedwetting an emotional sign too?
Bedwetting could be. Bedwetting can be caused by many different things, but that, if you combine that with some of these other signs, then that may be a sign that something is going on. But we have to do what we can to protect these children, and the big thing is to become friends with them, get them to tell, so that they trust you, so that they'll tell you their feelings, and get the abuse to come out, so that you can, as a citizen, can try to help them and get them away from their perpetrators.
Do some of the children seem to be angry?
Anger can be very much a part of it. Whenever you see anger in a person, you look for what is the fear behind the anger. There's always a fear behind that anger, and so if a child is very, very angry, you try to get them to talk about their fears. What are you afraid of? What makes you angry? What makes you fearful? And get them to talk about their feelings, and in that way try to diagnose what's going on.
Interesting. Well, this has been a great show tonight. I really appreciate you taking your time to come out and enlighten us on what's going on here. If anybody on the phone would like to ask Judy a question before we close out, go ahead and *8. And we would, Judy, being targeted and what we go through is, the same scenario. It's the MK Ultra program. It's just never stopped. And, it's just as hurtful as an adult as it is for a child. for someone not to believe you.
Yes, that's true.
You know, and for someone to just everything we've talked about tonight, people being murdered and raped and abused and alter personalities, and you had said at the beginning of the show, no one wants to hear this kind of thing. It's the same thing with a target. A target is being abused. They're being their homes are being entered. Their privacy is taken from them. They're constantly being traumatized. And when they try to tell their story, they have been implanted and tracked. And when they try to tell their story, they're immediately dismissed as, oh, you're crazy, or, you know, I don't want to hear this, it's too horrible. And, you know, it's dismissive.
It is. It is.
It's so insulting.
Mm-hmm. It is. Can you imagine being abused your whole childhood, finally coming out with that abuse, and then not having people believe you? You know. Plus, perpetrators do try to follow these people so that they won't tell, you know, so they won't expose what's happened to them. So they are targeted throughout their whole life, and their fears are very real, because it's not just the perpetrator that's following them, it's a whole group of perpetrators that are working in joint harmony with each other, trying to keep these victims from talking about what's happened. And they do extreme things to follow and control these people. I know of a victim right now who she has had, I think, 3 or 4 dental and medical and therapist scheduled visits this month that were canceled. Somebody called in and canceled her visits and then rescheduled them for another date.
I've had that happen to me.
Yeah.
I had the dentist pull a tooth. Well, actually, I switched dentists because I started suspecting my dentist. And my new dentist pulled a tooth, and I was so groggy, I didn't really, you know how you aren't with it. But I heard them say, "What is that?" And then the assistant said, "I have not a clue." And there was something in that tooth that they didn't know what it was.
You couldn't get a hold of it afterward, huh?
She disposed of it. She said, "Well, take it out of here." And I'm just wondering if they got something for it, or, you know, but I remember hearing them say, what is that? You know, like they'd never seen anything like that before.
Liz Gal, I'm talking about things that there's something implanted in her teeth that helps her being, she's electroshocked, and, you know, a lot of things are happening to her, and she thinks there must be something implanted in her teeth that, you know, helps them target her.
Dentists are heavily involved in it, and I also had some x-rays where I seen some things attached to my spine in 3 different areas. And in the one area is where I'm always getting hit in the middle of my back. So I know there's something there. The doctor that took the x-rays tried to tell me they were bone spurs, but these were perfect squares. And you know how when you take an x-ray, if you've got jeans on, the metal of your zipper looks different than your bones? And these squares look just like my zipper. They were metal, you know. But see, this is it, you know. I mean, people, that's just a bone spur. You're crazy. That ain't nothing, you know. It's all covered up.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but you know what? They can't hide it from God. He knows the truth.
They can't, and you know, that's what happened to Jenny. She was supposed to be sacrificed, and she was saved by an angel that appeared. And that experience has kept her sane, you know, to feel that, you know, Heavenly Father is watching over her, and she felt that it was her purpose in life to reveal her story so that other children who are going through this could be helped. And that's the reason why, when we first started writing this book, I had a pseudonym that I was going to use because I didn't want, my name on the book. And Jenny said, I'm not going to. I want my name on that book. I want those perpetrators to know that I have told, and I, I want to expose this. And so because she was brave enough to put her own name on it, I put my name on it. I thought, if she can do that, who am I to try to hide from it? And that kind of bravery is, I just admire these survivors that they're able to speak out, and I admire you that you're able to do this and to bring it out in the open, because that's where the public is going to learn about it is from the survivors. They're not going to learn it from some news broadcast or some court case, because that isn't going to happen. But I think the thing that makes me the most angry about being dismissed is that I've heard people say, well, this is too evil, I don't want to hear about it, and I don't care as long as it's not happening to me. But because they don't understand that it's an evil that grows, and it might knock on your door one day. It might be your kid or your grandkid that gets kidnapped and sacrificed. And, what a sad commentary to say is that if it doesn't happen to me, then I don't need to worry about it. But, we're all God's children, and we have to protect these children. It's our duty to. And I think people like you that have these radio shows are fantastic, that you're able to bring this out in the open and expose it. I take my hat off to you. Thanks, Judy. My hat goes right back off to you that you had the guts to put your name on the book and come out and publicly speak about this and actually read the documentation and point the fingers without fear. Well, I think that's the biggest thing is we got to get rid of the fear factor. We do. And I really encourage listeners to go in and read those first 3 chapters of 22 Faces on our website. It's 22faces.com. And in there, you will really understand what a little child goes through when they are being abused, and the wonderment of the body and the brain and how it protects them. Jenny, how we wrote Jenny's story is that she was told as a young child through prayer that she needed to write down her experiences, and as she would write down in her diary, her alters would take over, and they would start writing out their experiences. And from those very detailed writings, we were able to take the book. So we have all these feelings of not only what Jenny's going through, but what her alters were going through as she grew up. So it's a very detailed book, and it makes it quite interesting to understand what trauma does to a person and how they react to it, and the wonderment of our brain and the wonderful body that Heavenly Father has given us and how it protects us. So I encourage you to take a look at 22 Faces and understand that, so hopefully you can help other children that may be going through this. Amen to that. Well, again, Judy, thank you so much, and God bless you and Jenny and all the children of our world. Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. We'll look forward to you coming back again. Oh, I'd love to come back. Okay.